We are receiving reports coming in from Japan, Hiroshima, that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky are set to meet at the G7 summit. We are receiving reports that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is headed to Hiroshima, Japan, is set to meet President Volodymyr Zelensky at the G7 summit in Hiroshima. And our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sidhan Sibol, has been following all the events that are happening in Hiroshima. Sidhan Sibol, can you confirm this? What do we know so far?
Well, the big breaking here on WION, first break on WION, that the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Ukrainian President Zelensky will be meeting in Hiroshima. Now, this is a significant development. This is the first meeting between the two leaders since the Russia-Ukraine conflict started last year. We know that there have been telephonic conversations, particularly during the initial months of the conflict when India was trying to evacuate its students. Remember, there were 20,000 Indian students who were evacuated from Ukraine. But since then, of course, we know that India's focus has been on the resolution of the conflict, that the two sides should sit together and resolve the conflict. Now, last year, the Indian Prime Minister had met the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. He had met the President of Russia on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Samarkand and had
Well, that is our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sidhan Sibol. We seem to have lost him, but we'll get him back in a short while from now. But we understand we are receiving reports that the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be meeting the Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky at the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan. Sidhan Sibol, maybe you can continue with what you are saying.
So basically, I was saying that the Indian Prime Minister had met the Russian President last year in Samarkand on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, in which the Indian Prime Minister had emphasized on resolution of the conflict, saying that this is not an era of war. And since then, this phrase was something that was talked about by other world leaders as well. So essentially, this meeting between the two leaders, the Indian Prime Minister and the Ukrainian President, will be seen significant how India navigates its policy towards the ongoing conflict in Europe. India, of course, has taken a neutral stance, and while it has taken a neutral stance, it has been calling both Kiev and Moscow to resolve the conflict by sitting together. So far, there hasn't been any opening to sit together. The conflict remains a constant source of worry for Europe and across the world as well, particularly for the global south in terms of the food, fuel prices. That is something that India has highlighted several times at global platforms.
Sidhan Sibol, apart from meeting the Indian Prime Minister, how significant will it be for the Ukrainian president to meet leaders from the global south?
Well, yes, we know that. Let me give you a context first. The Japanese, who are the host of the G7, has invited 8 countries, which includes India, Australia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Brazil. And these countries, most of them are from the global south. For example, Comoros as well. India is seen as the voice of the global south. In fact, New Delhi hosted a summit virtually when it comes to countries of the global south. So essentially, the Ukrainian president will be keen to have an engagement with the countries of the global south, especially India as well, given that India is the chair of the G20 grouping. We know that the Ukrainian Deputy Foreign Minister was in Delhi just a few weeks ago and was keen that India invites the Ukrainian president to address the G20 grouping. Last year, Indonesia, as the chair of the G20, had invited President Zelensky to address virtually, but so far India has, of course, has kept quiet. But essentially, that's primarily because India last year had sent the invites to the invited countries, which included countries like UAE and Bangladesh. But largely today, of course, here at the G7, there's a long shadow of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how there can be a resolution. And while the G7 countries are united in single voice when it comes to condemning Russia, when it comes to invited countries like India, Indonesia, even Vietnam as well, they have maintained a neutral stance because they, of course, are keen about how this conflict impacts the energy prices and how that can be resolved, because we know that because of this ongoing conflict there has been tremendous pressure on countries of the global south, especially when it comes to food prices, fuel prices, prices of the commodities.
Well, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is expected to land in Hiroshima, Japan, and participate in the G7 summit, which is currently ongoing in Hiroshima, Japan. I've been talking to our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sidhan Sibol, who tells us that the Indian Prime Minister will be meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Sidhan Sibol, thank you very much. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.